leadership at IGE, and I will be serving as the moderator on today's. I would like to extend a special thank you to all of our callers who have dialed in to discuss the topic of advancing leadership for women of faith, practical tools, and lessons learned. I hope that you will enjoy and take part in today's discussion. I would like to welcome our distinguished speaker for today's call, Afifa Saeed. Thank you, Afifa, for joining us today and sharing some of your insights and expertise on women leaders of faith and their unique characteristics and contributions.
Thanks, Kristen. I'm really happy to be here.
Afifa Saeed currently serves as a senior fellow with IG's Center for Women, Faith, and Leadership and is a cultural anthropologist. Ms. Saeed recently served as senior advisor at the U.S. Agency for International Development, where she worked with Washington-based and field staff to develop policy, define best practices, highlight success stories, and otherwise build internal capacity and frame country strategies that reflect greater expertise in engaging in dynamic cultural context. She is presently a senior consultant for the Carter Center, research associate with Cambridge University's Institute on Religion and International Studies, as well as senior fellow and advisory council member for IG's Center for Women, Faith, and Leadership. Her work includes religion and development, gender inclusion, countering extremism, and integrating cultural context into development and diplomacy. For the past 25 years, she has designed and implemented initiatives to engaging traditional and religious leaders and institutions, human rights, radicalization, socio-political identity, and social entrepreneurship, among other emerging issues. Afifa has advised the White House, National Security Council, Department of State, UN Democracy Funds, World Bank, and various in-country government and non-governmental institutions on the same communities in Europe, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. Afifa founded a model individual whose core curriculum is peace education and civic engagement. She is a member of various interfaith social service and advocacy organizations in the U.S., and her involvement in community activism led her to run as a candidate for local office in 2000. She is a published writer and regular speaker on a variety of issues. Before we begin, I want to take a few seconds to provide a brief description of today's call format. We will start with approximately 20 minutes of commentary from Afifa, followed by 40 minutes of questions from the audience. Of the call, all participant lines will be placed on mute. If at any point during the call you have a question for Afifa, please press 5* and you will be placed in the queue. So with that introduction, let's turn to our call. Afifa, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Kristen. Like I said, I'm really excited to be a part of this regular feature that IGE has. And I really just want to start out by acknowledging and saying that we are living in a time of complexity. Whether it's the social, political, economic, and religious dynamics, they're all playing out in so many different ways and in so many different directions. And probably everyone on the call, and I know for sure those that we've been working with, feel more and more that we're compelled to understand these dynamics proactively and not just in response and trying to figure things out as they happen, but really be a little bit more conscientious about it on the front end, and then also recognize that we may have gaps in this understanding of how these dynamics work, and then also thinking about how we can be more positively responsive, even when we're trying to be proactive, but at times we have to be responsive. Well, how can we be more positive? And so with all of that, thinking about that as we do need to recognize more and more the role that each of us plays in these dynamics, the complexity of the dynamics, but also the playing out of them in different ways, and really more about how we can better engage different types of people, more and different kinds of approaches to some of these dynamics for it all to be useful. So I'm really excited that IGE is dedicating this session to women of faith leadership, because in my mind that signifies how we're recognizing that we need to talk more about these issues, bring them to the fore, and really have a good conversation about where people's experiences and ideas are on this. And I know IG has also been very interested in moving this forward on different levels, both in regions and in some of the countries that we all work in, but also to bring it to back to the connection of how do we share some of these best practices and lessons learned and so on and so forth. So really excited that we can put this on the agenda, put this on the table, and hopefully others on this call will also talk about how they've been doing that in their own spaces. So I'm excited for that. I just wanted to start off, and this is a little bit interesting for me because usually I'm in a much more interactive venue, so I can say something and people can quickly tell me that I don't make sense or I'm speaking too fast. So I'm hoping I'll pace myself well. But I wanted to start off with the idea of what good leadership is. We know what the basics are. We know that leadership overall involves decision making. It involves empowering others, being efficient, communication skills, and a strong work ethic, among many other things. But it's really interesting to start to drill down a little bit, and now we have enough body of information out there, whether you want to do the Google route or you want to actually look at some of the reports that have come out from management companies about what characteristics are important for leadership. So since 2007, McKinsey & Company, which is a leading management consulting firm, has been identifying and tracking these characteristics. They've been talking with thousands of decision makers to ask what are the components of good leadership. So they've come up with 9, which I think are important to, on the outset, outline and just put on the table as far as, a credible organization is saying that these are the important ones. So this is an order of importance. The first one is people development. Then we go to creating expectations and rewards. Number 3 is being a role model. Number 4 is inspiring or being an inspiration as a leader. Number 5 is participative decision-making as a leader. Number 6 is intellectual stimulation. Number 7 is efficient communication. And then 8 is individualistic decision-making. And 9 is control and corrective action. So these 9, and you can easily find them in some of the reports that they have out there, these are the 9 that have been identified as characteristics of leadership. So where does the women leadership aspect come into this discussion about leadership in general? Well, McKinsey, again, did a report in 2007, and they've redone that report now in 2013, which is Women Matters. So the first one was Women Matters. This one is Women Matters 2. And it shows how women fare in these categories of characteristics. So I said the 9. So women fare, in terms of their characteristics, higher than men in having these characteristics in the first, and again, as I was saying, they're in order, in the first 5 of these 9. So just really quickly, women score higher in having these characteristics in people development, expectations and rewards, role model, inspiration, and participative decision-making. Women are scoring higher in those characteristics. Intellectual stimulation, both men and women are the same. Efficient communication, they're the same. And then at the bottom of the list, individualistic decision-making and control and corrective action, men are scoring higher in those characteristics. So it's really fascinating, and for me as a cultural anthropologist, to look at the role men and women are playing in leadership. But the fact that I started the discussion by saying these 9 characteristics are identified as good leadership overall, and they're coming from both the corporate side of leadership, but also how it trickles into just leadership in many different forms and formats. So it's interesting to see that it's not just we're saying that women leadership has to be in opposition to men or has to be totally different, but we're seeing that actual leadership characteristics in themselves are something that women have within their own makeup and their own characteristics, and so it's an interesting connection to make and to understand. So that was interesting for me to really delve into the research itself, and then I started to talk to women leaders themselves and ask them, what does it mean for you to what do these characteristics mean to you, and so on. So, for example, a peacemaker in Nigeria was saying, and she's dealing with the situation there with extremists and so on. And she was saying, well, extremists and those who do harm, they have sisters, they have mothers, they have aunts, and they themselves are our brothers and our uncles and our fathers and our sons. So she said, I can't help but think of them in that way, and that's what I use in my approach to peacemaking in Nigeria, thinking of them in those terms, which she was pretty clear about saying that's not necessarily how the men in this field and in this arena think of them first and foremost, but that's how I approach it. Another woman leader in Pakistan was saying, well, leadership itself is to mediate. That's really the goal of leadership. No matter what level you're talking about, she felt it was about mediation. So in her mind, even if it's not about a conflict issue itself, but leadership is to create that space to mediate. So again, you're starting to see these characteristics that we outlined in the research start to come out in the way that women are talking about the role of leadership in their lives. So we can say that women leadership in the corporate, political, and civil society may look slightly different because there are different sectors and arenas. But what we're finding is that the principles of leadership are the same across the board, whether it's in a business or in policy making or in an NGO. The principles that women are adhering to or connected to or even relate to are the same. So for the purposes of what we're discussing today, which is very specific to women of faith leadership, I wanted to think about these principles. And I just want to take a minute to say what I'm saying women of faith leadership and what we generally think about when we think about this term. I'm really talking about women who identify themselves as leaders who are inspired by faith. And these could be women that are in formal or non-formal positions. And they're also not just leaders that are in a religious space. So we have, either ordained or women that are part of institutional religion, religious structure as women religious leaders. But in this discussion that we're having today, and I think, we can discuss actually later on how expansive this definition is, but really it's about women that identify themselves as being inspired by their faith. So that's what we're talking about. So if that's what the scope is, I wanted to just list out a few things that have come up, a few ideas of principles in terms of what these faith leaders are putting into play. And so when we talk about principles, it really just means how do they look at things, how do they approach them, and what's at play in their mind as far as a leader that is faith-inspired. So the first thing that many of these women faith leaders have said is it's really important to start from the possible. And that means that there's always a positive aspect to the work, whether it's the work itself that you're doing and you're accomplishing and working on, or the individuals that are a part of that work. This principle really just says, instead of just sitting on the negative or identifying the negative, let's look at the positive. So that would also be considered in the leader's own life. So as a leader, how does she look into her life and bring out the positive rather than the frustrations that may go along with being a leader? So one way to say this that some of the women have said, relationship with God is a way to resist the negative. So very clearly looking at the positive, looking at the positive, and amplifying the positive is the first principle that seems to be across the board. The second principle that I wanted to identify is also recognizing the advantage in a disadvantage. So this is really interesting for leaders that are working on, trying to negotiate in conflict and so on. And they were saying that even those who oppose us in our work, they have some goodness in them. And recognizing that even if there's some negativity there is an advantage in that relationship, and there's an advantage in engaging this difficulty or this difficult situation. And they were saying that creates a humility, both in the way that you're approaching it, but also goodwill from the other side. If the other side that you are engaging on is negative and also doesn't agree with what you're doing and so on and so forth, bringing this positiveness to it and recognizing that they have goodness, that we're all in this together type of thing actually creates much more moving progression in whatever the work is. So I thought that was important to recognize. The third principle that I wanted to identify which the women faith leaders especially identified with in their work, was to appreciate gradualism in others and in the work that we do. So this means understanding that things are incremental, they take time, and they may slip up and come back again. But the idea that they're bringing this from the sense that even faith has ebbs and tides, and it moves and progresses and goes down. So they were translating this idea of faith going up and down to the work itself and saying gradualism, which means things may take their own course, has to be appreciated and not fight against it, but really just make it a part of your work and embrace it. And a part of that is to be moderate and to understand that moderation means that things may take more time than they would otherwise. The fourth principle that we want to sort of highlight as well is what a lot of them said about being a faith leader, and especially as a woman, that we guard against bad intentions. Bad intentions is a very faith-based or oriented term, but really what they're saying is that there's a constant reflection on why we're doing something. Is there to gain in this? Why am I putting effort into it? But what am I thinking I'm going to get out of it? So this idea of intention and intentionality in leadership is something that is recurring when you talk to women of faith about their approach and about what they're trying to accomplish. The fifth principle that comes up is also very interesting on different levels. It's about continuing, the way that they phrase it is continuing your own spiritual training. And so this translates into learning constantly and refreshing perspectives and knowledge and not being stuck, even though, identify as a faith leader, this is what I do, this is who I am, and making all that clear, this underlying principle of, but I'm not always, I can't be static in my knowledge. I have to seek it and acknowledge that I don't know something and be much more responsive in learning and refreshing it and saying that I don't, I need to understand something further than I had before. So you can imagine in leadership position, this idea of learning constantly can be something that can be modeled. So another principle that's related to this, and it's sort of across the board, and we saw it in the McKinsey characteristics as well, which was obviously setting an example for others by action, and not only in deed. So not only making these proclamations, but actually playing it out and showing it and modeling it is far more effective. And these women said that sort of came to them naturally because they themselves respond to action and they themselves respond to what they see rather than what they're being told. So they find themselves doing the same, which is modeling what they would like to see change or what they would like to see people adhere to rather than talking about it. In fact, they were saying the less talk, obviously, the better because it's more effective. Another principle that came up was also this idea of forgiveness of error in others. So some examples were, giving 70 excuses for somebody before blaming them, but also before you don't forgive them and covering their mistakes. And on the flip side of that, the principle of standing for justice, even if it's against somebody that you know and care about, because justice trumps all of the other the issues that come up. So then the last thing that I wanted to emphasize as a principle was this empathy, idea of empathy. So yes, it's a nice thing to have, and it's good to be empathetic, but they are really talking about it as a principle for action. So if you use empathy and you appeal to those who you need to convince by personalizing the difficulties and experiences, you're then creating much more of a relationship that will be effective, both in the work that you're doing, but also to promote and to move forward the relationships that you build. So this idea that empathy is more than just a feeling or just a good thing to have, but it's actually a part of what you're doing. So how do all these characteristics sort of play out? These principles, they play out in the way that the faith leaders look and feel and talk and so on. So they were very clear. They said, and I've seen this, in much of the work that is global, and this is what's interesting is it's across the board. They say, we don't want to sugarcoat reality. Reality has to be what it is. We're not going to create an alternate reality. It has to be very clear. Second thing is to engage the heart. And, for people that aren't necessarily in the faith space and so on, they get a little bit anxious about, well, what are we talking about when we say engage the heart? But these women are saying it means really connecting at a deeper level than just, what need to be done. These women are also refusing to accept the status quo. So because they have a greater accountability in that sense, and they're answering to something greater, so status quo is not going to be something that is going to be easily acceptable because the accountability is there. They also create a sense of urgency. These women are saying the urgency comes from the fact that this has to be done, that we are called to do it. And so it has to be not just expressed, but it has to be affected and engaged with this urgency as well. And it's also calling, as a part of that, is calling people to accord with their highest values. So reaching out to folks and talking to them about what they themselves see as their values and their desires and their aspirations, and engaging at that level rather than just saying, well, you should do what I'm saying because this is really important. Women, we're talking about how that sort of comes across with their work. I thought it was also very interesting, a characteristic about acknowledging and embracing fear and saying that it is okay to be afraid of something because it's the reality, again, but also because it's a part of the process and a part of the experience. So these women are embracing it, saying it's okay to be afraid for myself and also for the work that we do, but then what do we do with that fear? And how do we, and so this is creating that safe space that some people may not agree or may not want to be a part of something, but instead of saying that we don't have room for people that are naysayers, this is actually creating the space, bringing them in and saying, okay, wait, I acknowledge that you have concerns and issues, let's talk about them and let's get into that. And then finally, this idea that, we paint a vivid picture of a better tomorrow rather than getting stuck in what the issues are that we're in right now. We know we can do something greater and better and so on. So it's really, really about that optimism that is grounded in reality that gets people excited about it. So all of this is about listening actively, speaking clearly, making eye contact that shows up in the behavior of these women and not humiliating others. I just want to spend a few minutes before we open it up because I know we probably have a lot of experience in the group here, just on some challenges with faith-inspired and faith-based women leaders. One of the ones is that there's a lot of changing and shifting in identities for women overall, which means women aren't stuck in one static space of this is who I am from now and forever. It shifts, whether it shifts in terms of, roles that they play as mothers, as daughters, as wives, etc., but also it shifts in terms of affiliation is not that critical, generally speaking, to one organization or one issue, and it shifts because they themselves are shifting and are very concerned about being responsive. There's another issue about this, and I call it so-called the invisible leaders, which is recognizing that there are alternative models for identification of leadership roles. It means you not see the women at the pulpit or with the mic, but yet they are leading in their example and so on and so forth. So how we look at those alternative models is really, really critical. And that's a challenge because if we don't see them as alternative models, we may actually just not have them on our radar at all. The second challenge is just the capacity and the skill building. It's great to have women that are inspired and are able to articulate and be leaders, but there is a challenge that many of the faith-inspired women themselves will say, but we don't necessarily have the skills, the communication skills, the management skills, the storytelling skills. We need to build those up. So that's important to keep in mind as far as the challenge. Another challenge that McKinsey has brought up in their work is that in order to have a change, and this speaks to people that say, why should we, work with women faith leaders? It really is important that we don't just have one or two here and there that we recognize, but it's important to cultivate and have a critical mass of women overall in leadership, but then specifically these faith-based women or faith-inspired women. We need to cultivate more so that they feel much more able to have impact both in their own communities and then collectively as well. And of course, I want to point out that the fourth challenge is for women of faith to have access to religious authority. It could be either that there are variations of interpretations in their faith that affect their leadership, but it's also representation in the decision-making, whether it's in conflict or policy or whatever arena they work in. being able to be represented in those decision-making spaces is really critical. And so this relates to a lot of options. A lot of times people make assumptions, for example, that women are not involved in religious interpretation or scholarship, that's just not happening. Well, that's an assumption that we need to challenge. Another assumption is that there's a secular religious divide, that women or men or anybody for that matter has to decide that they're one or the other and that there isn't a connection. That's an assumption we need to think about. There's also an assumption that faith leaders that are engaging secular organizations, in this case whether it's women's advocacy groups and so on, may be selling out and may be losing their faith identity, and that can be problematic. The other one I want to point out as an assumption is many people say that, well, we need to not necessarily engage religious leaders because it could be problematic. We need to phase them out because they are not necessarily as open-minded, and they're too dogmatic. They don't think critically and so on. So we want to think more about how can we disassociate from the religious space because it's not as effective. And that's an overall assumption about religious leaders. And of course, the last assumption I want to point out is that many religious folk or religious-based folks have this idea that secular spaces don't have room for religious engagement. In this case, again, women advocacy groups, some religious folks will think, well, there's no space for me there because all they want to frame the issues on are secular platforms. So you'll have people that are concerned about, in the U.S., for example, the Establishment Clause, that we can't do anything because there's separation of church and state. There's limited resources. There's not enough money going into, for example, engaging additional stakeholders, in this case women of faith, into the existing programs and so on and so forth. So there's just this limited understanding of what religion and faith and the role of that is. And I think that's an assumption, but it also leads to challenges as well. I'm just going to close out because I know we want to spend some time discussing on the opportunities that we can highlight and that we can think through, putting more resources into and so on. The first is we do actually need more research and understanding on how women of faith integrate religion into leadership structures. So I gave you this great example of the McKinsey report, which they've spent a lot of time and over time they've tracked. We need to do the same for women of faith. How are they integrating religion into leadership structures already? What are their characteristics that they have? So, the ones that I've listed, for example, are from my work globally and across many years as well. But just to be more scientific about it and put some resources into that, because obviously there's an impact that they're having. We want to be able to track that impact and understand it. The second opportunity I think is really important is integrating religious discourse and understanding into already existing policy and program areas. So there's work happening, right, whether it's in development or community welfare and so on and so forth, social justice programs, et cetera. Well, how do we integrate this religious discourse into that? And the reason I think of it as an opportunity is because there are some really interesting things happening that we can tap into and amplify and work with. But it's definitely an opportunity because this integration needs to happen rather than be a separate issue altogether. And again, we could go into some details about some ideas for that. The third, of course, opportunity that I think we need to think through is how do we build these platforms for sharing across the faiths? So across sectors as well. So you have social justice spaces, business, corporate, policy arenas. How do we build across all three of these and more, because there's quite a few others, how do we build these platforms for sharing? And within those platforms have this safe space where women especially, and then women of faith even more, can feel that they can speak about their work. They can speak about how they identify as a faith-inspired person and not have it be such that they have to justify that in some ways or have it be in such a way that they have to translate all the time everything they do. I have, done a lot of this work with folks that are talking about translating. So if you're, working with your house of worship or you're working with a religious institution, how do we translate what you do there into, for example, development speak? So we've had those conversations, and I think it's been fruitful. But on the flip side of it is, why do we always have to create that demand for translation, and how can we actually sort of have this connection with faith side of the issues and the other side, which wouldn't necessarily be non-faith, but it's also a matter of the way that the work is segregated out. So what are those? Building these platforms could help do that. It could help create the space to connect, but it could also help this conversation about what is it that we're talking about and how do we connect it at a level that would be more useful to others. So in the end of this idea of the end of the day in terms of how we're looking at connecting all this, I do think it's encouraging that more women of faith are becoming part of existing systems and structures, whether they're faith-inspired and based systems or they're just, the community type of structures and so on. So they're becoming a part of that in any case. And it's because they're being drawn to it. It's because they feel more confident. And I do feel very strongly, especially with the work that I've done with such women, that they're coming to their own and they're finding their voice. They're very concerned about keeping their voice and being authentic to their voice, being authentic to their own stories as well. So they're creating their own narrative, reflecting who they are and what they aspire to and how they can themselves contribute to the community and global welfare. So that's kind of the great, exciting time that we live in. So we started with all this idea of this complexity in all these areas, but the fact that people are taking ownership of what they can do and what they can't do, and then also bringing to the table, look, we can help make some of these issues be more effectively engaged on if we have that space and we create that space for one another and acknowledge that these are the strengths that, in this case, women have, and then specifically women of faith have, and how do we engage that in a way that's not instrumentalizing religion or women and saying, oh, yes, we've got a program where we have 5 religious women that are part of the training, check the box. We really want to make sure we don't get stuck in that space at all, but really think through how do we integrate it as a way that people think about the issues and think about the solutions that is more proactive, as I said earlier, and even when it's reactive, that it's a positive reaction and not just a reaction for the sake of creating a response, really. So those are some of the things that I wanted to outline just in terms of creating the framework for the discussion, but definitely knowing that we have folks on the call that are coming from various different experiences, it would be great to think through how maybe some of these principles and ideas may or may not translate out, and then also maybe what work has been done that can either reflect this or, if it does, maybe even contradict some of these approaches. But what's very clear to me from the work that I've been engaged in, both personally and professionally, we just can't afford not to engage everybody on all levels all the time in terms of bringing about some of this positive change that we want to see at all levels, really, at the community, at the national and the international level, and how all of this is going to be moving up and down very, very easily. So for that, again, I'm excited to be part of the IGE team on this and some of the work we've done with the fellowship that maybe Kristen can talk about a little bit more of women, religious faith-inspired women that are part of the fellowship, and how we'll be using some of the work with them to hopefully inform the research and inform some of this work moving forward. So I'll stop there, Kristen, and I'll let you go ahead and figure out the next part of the moderation. Thank you.
Thank you, Afifa, for that great introduction. We'll now open the lines for caller questions. As a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, please press 5*. When it is your turn to ask your question, the call administrator will announce your name and unmute your line so that you may ask it. Lines will be placed on mute following the asking of a question. If your question has been asked or you ask your question, please press 5* again, and your name will be erased from the queue. For the sake of other callers, I'll ask that when you are called upon, immediately ask your question rather than providing your own commentary.
All right, thank you, Kristen, and thank you, Afifa, for that great introduction. Our first question today comes from Megan Carner. Megan, go ahead and ask your question.
Yes. Thank you, Afifa. When you were naming the 8 principles, the two that stood up for me were forgiveness and fear. Forgiveness for most people of faith tends to be a faith principle, and fear being a spiritual, something spiritual. I wanted to know, was there a difference in women of faith who actually work in faith-centered environments and then women who work in business and corporate, if there was a difference in how they looked at forgiveness of error and fear, or how they, combated those two? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's great. And that was an interesting. I mean, overall, just comparing the two spaces, right? The corporate business, sort of the secular space, and the religious faith space. And it's just interesting because the ones that I listed from McKinsey, those are overall really good things to have as characteristics, and that the fact that women do them more is great. It's great to be able to say that women do the things that we need in leadership overall. But I think what you're touching on, this idea that there are some things that come from faith, in the sense that accountability and forgiveness and fear, and embracing, in this case, embracing fear, not just having fear, but understanding it and accepting it. A lot of times these women would base that in the fact that, well, I know as a believer I need to do these things. So, for example, as a believer I need to forgive. As a believer, there's of greater accountability. And as a believer, I need to understand that I have a connection that's deeper, and so on and so forth. But if you look at some of the way that women talk about how they approach leadership, or just their characteristics altogether, it doesn't have to be faith-inspired specifically. But in this case, they're able to track it to that and say, yeah, this is how Scripture tells me that forgiveness is really, really important, and here's the way that the tradition of this prophet or that story has shown it to me. But I guess, the difference in terms of the approach is that the women of faith, or faith-inspired, are more consistent in that, and they're more consistent in amplifying it. Whereas women that are not necessarily in that space or identifying that space, they may not say, I'm more forgiving. They may not say, I embrace fear, in the same way that maybe the terms and the ideas and the concepts are being used by women of faith. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's really about how they're articulating it and then how they're embracing it. But at the same time, I think, this is why we're having this discussion, is that there's some value added in bringing women of faith into the picture of leadership, because they're able to articulate it differently, first of all, and they're very, they want to articulate it differently, I guess is what I'm saying, because they comes from a different place in their mind. But they're not necessarily, so they're articulating it differently, but they're also exemplifying it differently in the work that they do. So you'll see that they'll say, I need to forgive because it's Scripture, but here's how I do it. So then actually showing that, modeling that, is what I find interesting. And then when I talk to women that are outside that faith space, or at least defined in that, they appreciate and understand where it's coming from. So we had this really interesting discussion in one of the conversations about women leadership, where we were talking about humility, which is another thing that comes up a lot with women of faith. That humility is paramount and it's important. It's just really, really something that they adhere to, they want to embrace, and they want to talk about in that term as humility. So other folks are saying, well, what if humility becomes a self-confidence issue? Because the other side of humility could be that you don't have confidence. You're so humble that you're not going to be confident about something, or you won't say something because you want to be humble. And I saw that interaction happen many, many times over. And specifically, it was between these two approaches, which is the faith-inspired and saying, well, humility is just a part of who you have to be. It doesn't mean that you have to be quiet or suppressed. It just means that how you approach things. Whereas folks from outside that perspective were saying, well, that's dangerous, because then you may not you may not stand up for what you believe, what you want to do, but it also means that, you'll just be too quiet, and you need to, women need to be a force in the room, is what you'll hear a lot of people say, because women need to find their place and take their place. And some of these women of faith will say, it's not about finding and taking and making our space. It's about the work itself. So it's an interesting discussion about approach and also about what the outcome is. So some of the faith-inspired women will say it's much more important to think about the objective of what we're doing and how we reach that objective, whereas other women might say, no, it's just as important that we make sure that we're part of the process and that we have women representation and so on and so forth. So, that's a little bit more expanded in terms of what you were asking, Megan, but I think those are sort of the dichotomies of approaches. But in the end, if you look at some of the leadership qualities that are really important, this side of it, which is the faith side of it, can really lend itself to creating more examples of how to do good leadership traits and character, how to put them into play, but also how to inform them in a way that might be more useful. So that's, and I think it's great to continue that conversation between the two.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rebecca. Our next question comes from Rebecca Rios-Con. Rebecca, go ahead and ask your question, please.
Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
I can, yes.
Okay, good. No, I wanted to thank thank you for the presentation, which I think is excellent. It has given me a lot to think about. My question is based on the work that I do with Arigato International that deals with mobilization of religious leaders of all faiths around interfaith dialogue to bring about changes for children. And we work very closely with UNICEF and other organizations that focus on the rights of children. And it's an interesting endeavor. It's challenging. And my question is, in your presentation, I did not hear you talk about the religious or faith-based women leaders talk about the power of prayer. And in our work, we promote prayer and action for children. And the use of prayer we find is very effective in different societies from all faiths. So I wondered if you had any thoughts about that. Thank you.
That's really great, Rebecca. I'm glad you honed in on that. And that's sort of an underlying principle on many of these issues for women of faith. And it's this idea that we're going to do a campaign on sex trafficking, right? Or we're going to do a campaign on this, or we have this project to do, and so on and so forth. So every time they talk about the project as a project, these women of faith will say, well, what's the first thing we need to do and what's the last thing we need to do? And then during the whole process, too. So this idea of prayer is intentional. It's part of the intention part of what I was talking about, which is to say that we have to take this action, but we want to take it with the intention, which is a prayer, that it has a good outcome. And the prayer, part of it, is the intentionality. It's like taking that breath and saying, okay, before we start this, before we do this intervention, or before we do this event, and so on and so forth, the prayer will be, and I've been a part of some of these prayers where it'll be, may goodness come out of our efforts, because we're doing this for the greater cause and the accountability that we believe in. And you could say it in all different ways for different faiths, but prayer has become something that is so embedded in the process of faith-inspired women that it both is a tool to start and end with, but it's also something that uplifts them. And so I was looking at some of the design modules we had for domestic violence that we're working on. I'm working with the Carter Center. So one of the things that came up there was, what can religious leaders do? And so there was, do this campaign, do that campaign, create a safe space in your church or your mosque or your temple for battered women to come to, and so on. So they're all listed there. And one of the bullet points was have congregational prayer about this issue. And it was interesting to the reactions, because some folks who aren't either into prayer or don't understand what role prayer plays were a little bit, sort of confused. Well, why would prayer be part of the action items? Well, the religious folks are saying, look, congregational prayer about something like domestic violence is not just a good thing, as religious people to do, but it actually mobilizes and gets the congregation to understand that this is our duty as religious leaders or religious folk to respond to. So the power of prayer, I think, is just amazingly, it has so many effects on different levels, both in terms of what it can do for people individually, but then also how it's a part of the whole process. So I'm really happy that you brought it up, Rebecca, because, if part of it is prayer, the other part is, for example, sermons, right? And we didn't talk about how religious folks use sermons and use scripture and so on to motivate and to help people understand the role of religion in some of these issues. And it's across the board. So we've seen that quite a lot as well. Is one of the skills that many religious leaders want to have is how to give a better sermon and how to integrate prayer and scripture and so on more effectively into their sermons and so on and so forth. So without saying that, so I want to do it on both ends, which is prayer in itself, recognizing the importance of it in a religious space and recognizing that it's both a salve and it's a starter for many of these issues, but then also understanding how it can be a part of a larger picture as well.
Great, thank you. Our next question today comes from Mr. Art Peterson. Art, go ahead and ask your question, please.
Yes. In a period of some years in studying leadership, we've been stressing self-knowledge. The Center for Creative Leadership, of course, it has said that's kind of the heart of leadership. And although you mentioned empathy, do you think that self-knowledge should be included, understanding oneself and people with one who works, as a critical element of leadership?
Oh, very much so. And one of the principles that we talk about is this continuing, your own self. Well, spiritual training is how some of them were saying it, but that's this aspect of learning constantly and refreshing your own understanding of things. And then if self-knowledge means to understand what you know and what you don't know, and understanding what, intentionality, again, what you're basing what you do on, that's a very critical part of leadership, because we have lots of folks in leadership positions that don't know themselves, in the bigger picture of things, but they also don't know how to understand what they don't know, and so on and so forth. So I think if I'm understanding self-knowledge in the context you're talking about, Art, then it is a matter of how people react and respond and build their understanding of themselves so that they can do this work better. So I know, a faith leader, a friend of mine that was working in government, for example, or working with government, was really concerned about, well, I'm working in a space that I find there's so much that is against what I believe in faithfully and so on. What should I do? So this goes back to prayer, but it also goes back to the response that his spiritual leader had for him, and told him, it's a matter of knowing why you're doing something, what's motivating you, and also being able to pray that you do things for the good, for better intent, for the best in outcomes, and so on and so forth. But this idea that we're continually refreshing and relearning and understanding it is a critical one, and it's also about making that space to do it. One of the things that we've been working with the IGE, the CWFL fellows, is also self-care and self-understanding. So one of the things we came up with was a personal leadership plan for the fellows, and then we expanded it to my faith, my leadership values, so that people can take the time to understand what are the values that I have in my leadership style. What are they? Let me identify them. If it's humility, if it's being inclusive, and so on. But then spend the time to understand and create knowledge on why those are important and how they're connected to my faith. So it's not just being humble because I'm a good Christian or I'm a good Muslim or whatever it is. Why does humility, why is it based in something that I believe in as a principle, and so on and so forth? So it's part of learning about your own self, and it's also a part of connecting yourself to what you do, and creating that space to understand that self-knowledge and self-reflection and so on is critical to how you do your work, but also sustain yourself. So I don't know, Art, is that the same framing you're taking it in as sort of as self-knowledge, or is there another way that we could look at that?
Nope. 25 psychometrics to understand oneself better, but you've answered the question very well. I think it was always viewed by the center that that was the first point of leadership. Understand what motivates others and yourself, and what essentially all the psychometrics tell you about yourself.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
And thank you.
That's great. Thank you.
All right. Our next question, I don't have a name affiliated with the number, so if you are calling in from 412-726-2153, your line has been unmuted. Go ahead and ask your question, and please introduce yourself.
Thank you. This is Rebecca Cataldi from the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. And I apologize because I have a cold. I hope my voice is not too messed up. Hi, Asif. I'm so glad to be part of this, and I really enjoyed your presentation. And I look forward to hopefully catching up on more of this further. But my question was, do you have any thoughts about the role of faith in cross-cultural engagement and in terms of women faith leaders who work in cultural spaces that are not their native culture or who work across cultures? What role does faith play in the spaces in peace building specifically? And maybe what advice would you have for women of faith who are working in different cultural spaces or across cultures? Thanks.
Thanks. That's great. And I know you've done quite a bit of that yourself, Rebecca. I mean, on one level, it's really important that we don't. That we acknowledge that the cultural context is really critical to understand, period, right, before we do any of this kind of work. So whether it's, conflict resolution, whether it's advocacy, whatever it is, the idea that cultural context and what that cultural context looks like, feels like, smells like, tastes like, to the extent that we don't, that's all we do. It's not that you have to know the culture entirely to be able to work in it, but at least understand what are the dynamics, how do people think about things, and how is the culture itself dynamic in that it's changing and that it's not stuck in this understanding we have of it is overall is really important to have in mind, and then have tools for that. So whether we're faith-inspired, faith-based, or not, to understand that cultural context is in itself something that changes, it's dynamic, but is also basis to understand everything else. So, understanding the norms, understanding the traditions, and so on. I think it's even more important, and I'm thinking about this more and more, even more important for folks that work in the faith space, either from being from faith-based organizations or actually working on interfaith dialogue. It's even more incumbent, because what happens a lot of times is you have these conversations with folks cross-culturally from different faiths, and if you don't understand that there's dynamism going on, that things are changing, and people are in their own faith spaces looking at things differently, whether it's reinterpretation of scripture and religious authority, whether it's new people coming into the scene and so on, it can really affect the way that we do our work in interfaith, whether it's dialogue or actual work that we do on the ground. I say that because as people of faith, in different faiths, everybody knows that there's so much that changes, but somehow we don't think of this change as being existent in the other group or other culture or other religion. We forget that, look, as much as it's changing in ours, it's the same in the other space. So if we're able to start to have these conversations with folks saying, today, how has the approach been different from before? That brings a little bit more openness in the conversation. So that's kind of the critical basis that I think is important. The next part of it is really to embrace the faith speak and the faith talk. And then bringing God to the table. In this case, if we're talking about God, or if it's another type of spiritual conversation, most people of faith are eager to have that conversation, and they don't have it enough because most of the other people that they're engaging with are not going to have that conversation, either because it's too personal, it's not relevant as they think to their work. So creating that space to say, we're going to start this meeting with a prayer. Could everybody say their own prayer, for example? Acknowledging it as something that's really important. And in this case, or in many cases, most non-Western cultures, I would say overall, but also, perspectives and worldviews, have a very embracing idea of faith and of God and of spirituality and so on. I've walked into conflict resolution spaces, for example, in India, where there's conflict between two villages over the river rights and access to water. And so we come into the room and we're sitting together, and there's an empty chair, and somebody says, well, that's the chair for the river god to sit in. And understanding what that means to that group, for someone like me coming from a faith-inspired, understanding that having the river god in the room is really important to them. And therefore it's important to me if I'm doing conflict resolution or anything like that, rather than, somebody who would be secular or not understanding or not accepting it, saying, no, we can't have that as part of the mediation process because we're just talking about the river, and so on. And there are many examples I'm sure you're all familiar with, is how people of faith can connect with people of faith across cultures, because you, first of all, acknowledge and respect that faith is important, and then beyond that, give that space to make it be much more, to interact on it, but also be much more responsive to it.
All right, thank you. We have time for one more quick question. And so our last question today is going to come from Marina Burnett. Marina, go ahead and ask your question, please.
Kind of to build up on the previous question, what strategies, in your experience, would be successful for promoting women of faith leadership in societies where it's not also only cultural restrictions, but where women's leadership and religious leadership are suppressed for various political reasons? I'm thinking of countries of Central Asia, where the governments not only are uneasy with women's leadership, but also at this point are uneasy with faith and religions in general. Thank you.
That's a big one to end on, Marina.
Sorry.
That's a whole session in itself, for sure. Well, I mean, again, it's going to have to be a matter of identifying why, first of all, religious engagement is important, right? And we've had to do that in small little steps here and there. I mean, I was working in the U.S. government where it was a matter of, can't really mention the word religion, to the point where now we have a White House strategy on religious engagement. So, it's a incremental part of it, but it's definitely talking about building awareness, understanding that, look, this is what we're talking about when we say religion. We're not talking about dogma necessarily, or we're not talking about scriptures and using them and so on and so forth. I mean, it's a matter of how we present what we're trying to do. In this case, if it's, engaging religious leaders, well, can we engage them on issues that, for example, in the example you're giving with the government, that the government needs and wants to engage on, whether it's, community policing or it's education and so on. Can we bring these folks in to at least have that interaction so they're seen as going beyond their specific role as religious leaders and become much more as part of the solution for solving problems? I would say that would be one approach, is how we look at religious leaders and religious institutions and take them out of that box. And then the other aspect to that is also acknowledging that, that there are more and more religious-minded folks that are in these spaces already, in the secular spaces, and how they are already working on these issues is also really, really important. And for the sake of, how women themselves, I mean, one way is to acknowledge and identify women that are doing this work as faith-based women. But the other thing is to, meet them where they are and ask them, well, what are you doing for these issues, and how can we support that, and not just, instrumentalize and not just highlight them for the sake of us trying to get more people identified. It's really about meeting them where they are and seeing what they need. I was in Afghanistan meeting with a lot of mullahs. People had said, the secular policy and programming people, even within the Afghan government, had said, well, we're not sure if we really want to keep engaging them because we want them to phase them out. They're just religious leaders. But these religious leaders are saying, look, we need capacity building in doing the work we do, which is in health and conflict resolution. And I said, what kind of capacity? And they said, we just need paper and pens because we're taking people's stories and taking people's issues. We don't have enough things to write on. We don't know how to engage them. Another one said, I want help in understanding my community's needs. So how do we help them with community mapping and build that skill set so they can better understand how to listen to the community and take those priorities from the community and have some action on it. So it's kind of a two-way thing in terms of recognizing that. And again, the suppression side or the places where it's more difficult, we can have some specific approaches to that. But I would say that in many places, even if there's not suppression, there's still hesitation. There's still the sense that we don't know if we want to engage these folks because they're going to be too narrow-minded and too dogmatic, which isn't necessarily true. So, I think it takes a nuanced approach to do that. But yeah, let's schedule that for the next time we talk.
Well, thank you so much, Afifa, for that truly engaging and insightful conversation. We really appreciate it. And thank you to our callers for joining us today. I hope you will join us again on our next Faith and International Affairs conference call on Thursday, May 28th, where we will highlight the spring 2015 issue of IG's journal, The Review of Faith and International Affairs. Asma Uddin will serve as our distinguished speaker as she discusses public order and public morality, uses and abuses of the legal limits on free speech and religious liberty. Thank you all again and have a wonderful day.